Welcome and thank you for joining the Green Manures Findings from Eastern and Western Canada webinar. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Marla Carlson and I'm Executive Director of Sask Organics, and I'll be moderating today's session. I'm speaking to you today from Regina, Saskatchewan, situated on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. These are the territories of the Nahiawak, the Ashanapek, the Dakota, the Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Meat Nation. This webinar brings together findings from years of research on green manures in organic cropping systems in both Eastern and Western Canada, and we are pleased to be able to host this great lineup of speakers. So before we get going, I'm going to go through some housekeeping. It doesn't matter how long we've been doing this, or it's always good just to remind folks how to use this platform, because we're all sort of learning or using a whole bunch of different platforms over this last year or so. So the first thing is to close down any unnecessary programs that might be running in the background. This will help improve the quality and audio. Attendees are in listen-only mode, so only moderators and panelists can speak. However, please do ask your questions. Just you see that arrow pointing off to the right-hand side, you'll see a box that says questions. If you click on that and type in your questions, we'll be sure to get to as many of them as we can. And if you're phoning by phone, you will have been prompted to enter a PIN. If you didn't do that, then we're going to hear your background noise. So please keep muted at all times to help us keep up the sound quality. The webinar is being recorded. Attendees will receive an email link within an hour of the end, or within a day of the end of the live webinar, and some sponsors have provided handouts, and if the speakers have any handouts that they'd like us to share, we can do that at that time as well. And then last but not least, please bear with us, as sometimes we still have technical glitches, but we'll do our best to make it run as smoothly as possible for you here today. A big thank you to our sponsors. First up, a gold sponsor, Grain Millers. Thank you also to ProCert, our second gold sponsor, and our third gold sponsor, FW Cobbs. And then finally, thank you to our bronze sponsors, Weed Surfer, Organic Crop Improvements Association International, and BioFert. So we can't do it without you, and we really appreciate your support. And just very briefly about Sask Organics, more about the sector than about our organization, but we are the Industry Association for Certified Organic Farmers and Processors in the province. We're farmer-led, a nonprofit, and we represent 941 organic crop producers with 1,052 certified organic entities in the province. And we have just over 1 million acres under organic management in Saskatchewan, and that's about 30% of all organic acres in Canada. And now, while you're all here, I'm really pleased to introduce our first two speakers, Dr. Derek Lynch and Dr. Carolyn Marshall. Just so you have a sense of how we're going to go through the morning, Derek will go first, followed by Carolyn. And what we would like to do is take all questions at the end of their two presentations. So kicking us off is Derek Lynch. He's a professor of agronomy and agroecology at Dalhousie University, Faculty of Agriculture, and held the position of Canada Research Chair in Organic Agriculture from 2005 to 2015. Current research projects in Atlantic Canada and Quebec are examining the impact of farming systems and management practices on soil carbon, soil health, and soil biota. And I'll also introduce Carolyn so we can just smoothly go from one to the next presentation. Carolyn Marshall completed her PhD with Dr. Derek Lynch at Dalhousie University, looking at the impacts of no-till green manure management on soil health in organic rotations. She is a postdoctoral researcher at Dalhousie and is passionate about all things soil related. So thank you again so much, both for being here today, and over to you, Derek.
Okay, thanks very much, Marla. I'll share my screen. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen. And thank you, Deb and Marla, for putting this together and the invitation to talk about this great topic of green manures. And it's really nice to be on this panel with Carolyn and Martin especially on this really interesting key topic to organic farming systems. So I'm going to talk about mainly just to give an overview, first of all, on how we've been working on green manures and the connection there over the last 15 or 20 years. But just as an introduction, a lot of that work over the last 15, 20 years has been looking at different organic farming systems, varying in intensity and in design of those farming systems, whether they were livestock or cropping systems, and looking at these overlapping topics of nutrient dynamics, soil health, and biodiversity. Biodiversity mostly looking at soil, a whole range of soil biota and soil life, both abundance and biodiversity. And looking really at what's the net effect of the approach of the farming system. What's the net effect? If it's a short rotation or a long rotation, what are the dynamics of nutrients and soil health and soil life? But instead of just focusing on one practice or one phase of the cropping rotation, trying to get a sense of the net effect. And I think that's really important, especially in organic farming systems, where often those are really interesting dynamic that's happening across the approach to cropping. And of course, in organic farming, these are all related, especially in organic farming, nutrient dynamics, soil health and soil life are very related. But to focus in a little bit more towards green manure, so if we think of, I'm going to mostly talk about a little bit the sort of nutrient side and leave it to Carolyn to talk about the soil health aspects. But if we think of green manures and forages as kind of key engines or central to productivity in organic farming systems, you know, we've done quite a lot of work, both in experimental trials, but out on farms, looking at, well, how productive are they? What's the legume content? What's the nutrient status? Both not just the nitrogen and the biological nitrogen fixation, but what's also the phosphorus status of these key components of organic farming systems. And you know, we know in organic farming we tend to have less nitrogen cycling, less phosphorus cycling, and that can be good. We have more legumes flourishing as a result. We have more mycorrhizae flourishing as a result. But is it sufficient? Is it sufficient? And if not, do we need to tweak in terms of targeted use of amendments or even tweaking the feed input, nutrient inputted feed into livestock systems? Or if we're, and I think Martin's been exploring a lot, integrating livestock back into cropping systems to address that, to get to that sufficiency level of nutrients. And just to carry on with that broad introduction in terms of fertility aspect related to this, you know, both work out on commercial organic dairy farms and work, Joanna, Thiessen Martin and Martin in partnership with them, working on farms in Manitoba, looking at, you know, often very low soil phosphorus levels, and does it matter? You know, are we getting down to, in some cases, critical levels that show up in the tissue of the forage or show up in the tissue of the green manure? And if you're talking green manure, that may influence the release of phosphorus following that green manure in that crop rotation. And how does that link back to sort of overall farm nutrient status? And so is there a need for a sort of targeted use to complement the benefit of green manures, targeted use of targeted nutrient management specific to organic, you can say, to address those levels. And so if we just think about the amendments for a moment, and a lot of work over the years of both the sort of standard amendments for organic, which are rock phosphate and manure compost, but then looking at some of the more novel ones as well, deliberately, to just see, you know, what are the options, should these be considered in organic standards, etc., as options for bringing in phosphorus and nitrogen and some other nutrients. And the early work with looking at rock phosphates with buckwheat as a green manure, and buckwheat's of interest because it does accumulate phosphorus. Was it able to help mineralize and supply phosphorus to the following crop? And we showed there were some challenges there, that there's really some limitations there, especially in high pH soils. Further work, just some preliminary work with struvite or urban phosphorus under controlled conditions, where we were looking at can we overcome those low P limitations. Amanda Ward's work in soybeans and alfalfa, comparing it to compost. And but really, I want to bring in the green manures. We're supposed to be talking about green manures, and so really I'm going to talk about the last couple of studies where we looked at municipal composts combined with green manures and potatoes, and then we looked at dried, dehydrated, pelletized manures more recently in malting barley, but also particularly in wheat. I'll show some results from that work as well. But how much do we need, and when, what's sufficient? What are we talking about to combine and make sure the green manure and the whole system is very productive? And I'm borrowing here from Martin's long-term green manure study, or long-term Glen Lee study, has really shown very well that even a occasional use of composted manure can be all that's needed. Tandra Fraser in work with Martin using those soils did a long-term greenhouse study looking at Italian ryegrass, where we supplied all the nutrients except phosphorus for over 5 or 6 cuts of ryegrass, and showed that as the arrow is showing here, and Tandra's work really wasn't on the fertility, it was on the soil bacteria. What do they think of these long-term soils? What do they think of the different types of phosphorus being brought in? How did the soil bacteria respond to that? But it just as well showed that even that one-time application of composted manure at very modest rates made all the difference in terms of the growth of the ryegrass over that 160 days. So the point being, again, what's the targeted input of whatever that source of nutrient is to combine with green manures? So that's what I'll talk about in the last few topics. Different studies, one with potatoes, looking at different types of green manures. Here we have red clover, 2 years of red clover. This was a 5-year rotation. We ran it twice. 2 years of red clover, which was sort of standard practice prior to the heavy feeder, the potato crop, and then comparing what at that time was still a fairly novel green manure, oats, peas, and vetch, certainly in the Eastern Canada, to see how does that perform compared to 2 years of red clover. And then just in the potato year, combining with a modest rate of different compost to see, is there a supplemental benefit to the green manure of combining with an amendment? And just some pictures of those. So the different composts, again, brought in mostly as a phosphorus source, even though these soils were not low phosphorus status. Looking at novel composts, municipal food waste compost, and a paper mill compost, which are readily available nitrogen, but would have some phosphorus supply in them. And so we had either just the green manure or the green manure with the compost, and then a control with some fertilizer. And again, just applied in the potato year over those 5 years. And just some brief summary of those results. So in green, the green manures alone, and it really showed that hairy vetch was as productive as those 2 years of red clover in providing those really quite good, or by organic management, yields, potato yields. about sort of 25% less than conventional. But so the hairy vetch was as good as the 2 years red clover, but the compost, one of the compost added to that yield benefit as well. In terms of soil, and that was both yield and quality of potatoes, or size of potatoes as well. But it was really interesting. We did some further work in looking at soil health, and we showed that really the green manures were, as expected, those green manures were really providing to end supply, and whereas the compost really added to soil quality in a number of different ways. We measured soil quality. So there's a real complementarity there in terms of the role of the amendment and the green manure. More recent work in collaboration with Anne Vanasse of Laval in Quebec. We ran a study over 2 years at 2 sites in Nova Scotia and in Quebec. Rosalie Madden was the master student, and this was shorter rotation. So looking at just 1 year of green manure prior to wheat, followed by soybean. And again, looking at type of green manure compared to essentially no green manure. If you just had soybean before the wheat, or if you had oats before the wheat, looked at timing of tillage. Did that matter, fall or spring tillage? And then again, if you go into the wheat phase, if you just rely on the green manure, or you supplement with some varying rates of a dehydrated pelletized manure, which again would be supplying nitrogen to some degree, but again it's a significant phosphorus source. And the different green manures we studied in those 2 trials over 2 years were red clover, just 1 year of red clover in this case, common vetch and oats, and hairy vetch and oats. We did a lot of work on biological nitrogen fixation of the legumes, etc., but I just want to show the wheat results. So again, the hairy vetch, the biomass of the hairy vetch was tremendous, as has been shown by Carolyn Hall and Martin's team out west, a lot on farms as well, very productive green manure compared to the common vetch in this study. The blue is the amount of nitrogen that was released. We studied that in detail, and you can see compared to soybeans beforehand, really quite an end supplying ability of these green manures. The red clover performed equally as well in terms of end supply because of its below ground biomass as well. In terms of the wheat response, so this was quite interesting. If we start just on the left, where you're just relying on the green manures of the previous crops, the yellow is the soybean. You can really see all the green manures provided a yield benefit of up to a ton per hectare of wheat. And the hairy vetch in green, in the darkest green, was the most beneficial in terms of wheat response. And then it gets more complicated. If we bringing in that poultry manure at very modest rates, less than a ton per hectare, up to double that or more, you can see there's a combined benefit of if there was no green manure, that's really what you're relying on in yellow there. If it's the preceding crop of soybeans, whereas combining the hairy vetch and the green manure and the poultry manure, and this is approved for use in organic, this particular product, you're getting that combined benefit. But I think what's important to realize too is the phosphorus benefit of that material, or whatever other material, will continue beyond that immediate wheat crop response. And that's the interesting piece, where what that tipping point in organic system to maintain productivity of every element of the crop system, including the green manures, very much so, and followed these trends. So lastly, I just want to mention the current recent study we're working on in Quebec with Stephanie Laverne, and this is in partnership with Carolyn Hall at Laval. And so this is out on farms across southern Quebec, large organic grain farms that are running 3-year cash crop rotations. And here we're interested in can we, are they adequately including green manures, and what's the sufficient level of green manure sort of intensity, if you like to think of it that, whether it's underseeded or it's fall seeded or it's in the corn or it's in the wheat phase, how does that maintain soil health across these fairly intensive otherwise cropping systems? And that's a picture in the middle of oats and peas in the fall following spring wheat. And we thought the soybean phase is the mid phase. It's the furthest removed from the best management practices. It's the most tillage intensive. So we would have expected the soil health to be lower during that phase. And we're finding that in terms of aggregates, in terms of active carbon. But the whole point is, again, to come back to where I started, is what's the net effect? Do those other two phases with using amendments and green manures act as regenerative phases, if we like to use that term, and for the more degrading soybean phase, if we put it that way. And we're seeing that with the earthworms too. We're tracking earthworm biodiversity and abundance, and the winter wheat, if they use winter wheat or green manure phase, really regenerates earthworms as well. And we're looking at biodiversity as well. So just to finish, that was a fast walk through different studies, and we have summarized this in a couple of bulletins, an 8-page bulletin and a 2-page fact sheet, with the really great help of OACC in putting these together. I've provided these to Deb at Saska Organic if you wanted to have a look at those summaries, but they're also on the linked websites of OACC. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Derek. We're going to hand over to you now, Carolyn. So Deb should be making you presenter, and we will wait for you to share your screen. Thank you so much.
Focus on green manures, looking at how they interact with soil disturbance and what that means for soil health. I know Marla gave a little intro at the beginning, but just to sort of put myself in context. So I'm a researcher at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia. My PhD was under one of the federal organic science clusters, and I worked on similar system. I worked with Derek and in a similar system that he talked about, where we had full season green manures in an organic grain rotation, and I was looking at no-till green manure termination. And then since that was my PhD project, and since that finished up a few years ago, I've done some work with the Atlantic Soil Health Lab. So that's where we were looking at on-farm soil health and how it relates to management and cropping systems. And I'm going to tie that project in with my PhD in this talk as well. So many of you are probably familiar.
Carolyn, I'm just going to interrupt just really quickly. Do you mind turning your webcam on?
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. Thank you.
Ta-da. Okay. So if you are not familiar with a no-till green manure, here's like a little comic strip of the progression. So this is a picture of a hairy vetch oat, which is one of the ones we worked with. And instead of tilling it in at the end, we used a roller crimper, and it sort of flattens it to the soil. So it killed the oats, the crimping, but the vetch stayed alive, but it did winter kill. So the middle bottom picture there is what you get in the spring. An interwoven thatch that completely covers the soil surface, and then you no-till your cash crop directly into that. So the final picture there is some wheat coming up, and you can see the green manure mulch is still there between the rows. So why would you, first just to sort of draw a comparison. So no-till in conventional agriculture looks a lot different than this no-till green manure, and I just want to emphasize that. So you can see there's the top picture there is just a no-till corn system. So there's some corn stubble still rooted to the soil and then some residue on the ground, but it's not fully covered. There's not a lot of biomass there. Its only purpose is sort of to limit soil disturbance. Whereas with this green manure, you get a lot of biomass. It's fully covering the soil surface. And its intention is to add that biomass to the system. That's why you've grown a green manure. You can see here's another picture of one of our research plots, and the soil is completely covered. You can't see any bare soil. So it's a lot different than a conventional system. So why would you choose to do this instead of just tilling in your green manure? So it provides a non-mechanical weed control. It acts like a physical barrier, like any mulch, to prevent the weeds from germinating and emerging. You're reducing tillage and soil disturbance, so you should be improving your soil health. There's lots of studies that show that reducing tillage reduces soil health. And by reducing your tillage, you can also reduce your costs. So that's some of the reasons why you might choose to do this. So a lot of the assumptions about the benefits of this come from no-till and conventional agriculture. And like I said, those are very different systems. So this project wanted to look more closely at the soil health. So are we seeing the same benefits of soil health as you would see in a conventional system? And I'll also talk a little bit about weed control because that's one of its purposes. Why you would do this is to control weeds. So I had a research site in Nova Scotia, and I also had one in Carmen, Manitoba, where I worked with Martin Entz, who will speak after me. So this is a picture from my site in Carmen. And this is during the wheat phase. So we had our full season green manure the year previous, and then the wheat was no-till seeded into the rolled manure, green manure. So you can see on the left side of the red line that previously had a hairy vetch barley green manure, and the other one was a pea oat. And if I didn't have the red line there, you could probably still clearly see the line. There's just a ton more weeds growing in the peas. It's really visible. A lot of thistle came up and competed with the wheat. Whereas on the hairy vetch side, you just got a much cleaner, it was just better at suppressing the weeds. And that has to do with the biomass. And that's been shown before by other work, some of Carolyn Hall's work. So our hairy vetch barley was able, in the spring, we measured how much mulch was left. We had about 6 tons per hectare, whereas the pea oat had less than 4. It just wasn't a thick enough mulch to suppress the weeds. And then once you get to that point, there's not really anything else you can do. You can't bring in a mechanical weed control because it's going to get all tangled up in the mulch that you left behind. We saw a similar thing in the Nova Scotia site. So we just had the one green manure here, the hairy vetch oat, but I'm comparing a plot that was no-till seeded to one that was just regularly tilled. You can see the no-till wheat is shorter, it's not as green, and there's lots of weeds there. Whereas the tilled stand is much taller, more uniform, much less weeds. And here you got less than 3 tons per hectare of biomass. So this is one of the big tricks with no-till green manure, is that if you're going to get proper weed control, you need enough biomass, and it's really important. Like I said, you can't go in with other mechanical weed control methods after the green manure mulch is there because it gets all tangled up. But the biomass is often inconsistent. I showed we had different biomass based on the type of green manure. It also varies by location and soil type. At our Nova Scotia site, we had a lot of variation just based on differences in soil texture throughout the site. It was really inconsistent. So that's a big challenge with this no-till green manure. And so what does that mean for soil health though? Part of the reason to reduce the disturbance is to improve soil health. So do we actually see that? So I'm going to be comparing our 3 tillage treatments. So we had a fall tilled terminated green manure where we used a moldboard plow, plowed it under in the fall. It was bare all winter. There was a spring tilled where we left the mulch over the winter, but we tilled it in before seeding. So you're still seeding in bare soil. And then the no-till where you seed into the mulch. So we looked at soil carbon. And we looked at the top 15 centimeters and we divided it into the top 5 centimeters, so the very surface, and then 5 to 15 below that. So for total carbon, you can see we didn't see any differences in the amount of carbon, which is not unexpected. Total carbon can take several years to show the results of management. So we also looked at particulate organic carbon, which is the second graph. It's just larger pieces of organic matter, the fresher stuff you've been adding, it responds more quickly. So we did see a difference in the surface soil. There was more carbon with no-till, but there was less carbon in no-till for 5 to 15 centimeters, and the overall amount was not different. So we didn't change the amount of carbon, we just changed where it was in the soil profile. You know, when you till in a soil, you're mixing that biomass throughout the soil, whereas no-till, you just leave it all on the top, and as it decomposes, it just adds to the top. So we didn't change the total amount, we just changed where it was. And then we looked at soil organisms to see how they responded under the different treatments. So the first graph is microbial biomass. We measured it 2 weeks after the spring tillage event, and then 2 months after tillage, and then 4 months. So you can see at 2 weeks, there was a negative effect of the spring tillage, which had just happened 2 weeks previous, but no difference from the fall that we had tilled the previous fall. And then by 2 months, there was no difference anymore. It's a lot higher at that 2 week mark, just because that's the spring, everything's warming up, and you get sort of a flush of nutrients and activity. That's why it's higher there, but we're more interested in the differences in each time period. So differences at 2 weeks after tillage, but then it was gone by 2 months. It's very transient. The microbial population had no lasting effects of the disturbance. And then we looked at earthworms. So earthworms are a little bit slower to recover. Their life cycle is longer, so you might expect them to be more detrimentally impacted by tillage. They also don't like being tilled, can chop them into pieces. It pulls them up to the surface where they get eaten by worms. So in the first years, this was the spring of the wheat after our cover crop, after our green manure, we did see a big impact. There was a lot more worms in the no-till plots compared to the plots that had been tilled, which, like I said, it's what you expect. Earthworms don't like being tilled. When we came back the following year, so there was no additional tillage, the earthworms had started to rebound, but still lower. But then by the third year, there was no differences. So it took a couple years, but they were able to rebound. So the organisms here were really resilient. They were impacted by tillage, but it was short term, and given the amount of time required, they can recover. So this was all sort of surprising. It's a big difference we're doing here, like no-till, completely undisturbed soil versus full inversion tillage, and we didn't see any of those negative effects that we're supposed to see with tillage. So what we think is happening is that using a green manure in a regular pattern in your rotation is creating a well-fed soil. You're constantly adding fresh material. You're replenishing that particulate organic matter we talked about, and it just gives the soil sort of a extra pool of carbon for the organisms to use to replenish lost carbon. It's creating like a buffer against the negative impacts of tillage. And so I'll tie that into some of our more recent work. So that was a research study. We had 2 locations, but it's still just a few research plots. So what did we find with our broader farm survey of the Atlantic provinces? So this project had involved soil from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. We also collected management histories from the producers for the 3 to 4 years previous. And we measured about 21 different soil health parameters to create a database. And I'm just showing you sort of a breakdown. We tried to get all the different types of cropping that we have in this region. Row crops, so corn, soybean, grains, forages, pastures, vegetable systems, small fruits like strawberries and raspberries and blackberries. We had a few vineyards, and then blueberries we kept separate from the small fruit because they're just very different in their soil. So we looked at the management histories, and we broke it up into sites that received organic amendments, so compost or manure, and sites that didn't. And then we further broke that down based on the number of tillage passes in the 2 years previous, sites that we considered high disturbance and sites that we considered low disturbance. And so I'll show some of the soil health parameters that we measured. So the first one's total carbon. And you can see, so the first box in the plot is for sites that received amendments but were also high disturbance. And the arrow is pointing, it's comparing it to the sites that were still high disturbance but received no amendments. And so we saw higher carbon, we saw higher particulate organic matter, we saw the same pattern with ACE protein, which is an important soil health parameter that measures another pool of the organic matter in the soil, water stable aggregates, so how good is your soil structure, and we saw the same pattern with a few other variables as well. So it seems that adding these amendments, compost or manure, helps mitigate the negative effects of being a high disturbance system. So the tillage itself didn't negate the positive effect of the amendments, it was sort of the opposite. The amendments mitigated the negative effect of tillage. And then we looked at a subset of just the horticulture crops, so just the vegetable and small fruit, because those are very high intensity, high disturbance systems. And we divided them into rotations that had incorporated cover crops and those that didn't. So we saw increased active carbon, that's just another carbon pool. So higher levels of active carbon, higher levels of soil respiration, which is just a measure of microbial activity. They were both higher with cover crop use. Same again with ACE protein, biological nitrogen availability. So this is the nitrogen that microbes can make available in the soil for plant use. That increased as well. So even in these really high intensity, high disturbance systems, we can see the benefit of using a cover crop. So what does this mean sort of for the overall big picture? So a criticism of organic that I've heard over and over again is that it uses too much tillage. And we know that tillage leads to loss of organic matter, loss of soil life, or breakdown of soil structure. But a lot of that information to base that on is coming from conventional systems. Whereas organic systems are different. And if you think about it, so if you think about the term conservation agriculture, it has 3 pillars: minimal soil disturbance, having soil cover and living roots, and having diverse crop rotations. But I find a lot of the discussion and debate around this focuses mostly on tillage. A lot of people seem to talk about conservation agriculture, but they are only referring to it in terms of the amount of tillage or soil disturbance. So while organic might have more tillage, I would say it does better overall on having soil cover and living roots and crop rotations. Of course, you can have organic production that's very intensive and doesn't necessarily incorporate those things, but in general, organic farming tends to be better at 2 and 3, maybe not so much number 1. And so this is a meta-analysis that I found. It just came out this month in June. So a meta-analysis, it took studies of farming from all over the globe, and it looked at 7 soil health parameters and measured the impact of cover crop, organic amendments, and conservation tillage. And how the graph works, so it's a response ratio. So they compared use of cover crops with no use of cover crops, and if there was a benefit in those soil health measurements, then your response ratio is above 0. If there was no difference, if they were the same, it would be 0. If the no cover crops were better, it would be negative. So you can see all 3 of their other practices they looked at benefited soil health. They're all above 0. But conservation tillage wasn't the most impactful. The greatest impact was actually seen by using an organic amendment. And I would put green manures under organic amendments. That's their purpose, to add to the soil. So I think when we focus on tillage, you're missing a big part of the picture. Tillage is important, and reducing tillage can help soil health, but it's not the only part of the picture. It might not even be the most important part of the picture. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. And studies constantly show organic production has higher soil health than conventional systems, regardless of the level of tillage. So these practices of using green manures and cover crops have the potential to really improve our soils and to make these cropping systems more resilient so that we can do tillage without worrying about the damage we're causing to the soil. It's a more holistic way to look at the system. So that's my section. So thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And Derek, I'll bring you back in now as well. We have a bit of a quiet crowd here this morning, but I do have one question, which is what type of seeder is being used to seed into the crimper green manure?
So we had a no-till drill seeder. I don't know the specifics of it, but it has blades that are sort of like, if you look at it from above, so it cuts the green manure and sort of spreads it a little bit apart. So there's a little path, and then it drops the seed in behind that. And it worked pretty well. It cut through the mulch very well. We also tried it with a fall rye that was rolled with soybeans, and we found that was a little bit trickier because it's just harder to cut through the fall rye. So I don't know if you have any comments, Derek, about no-till seeders that you've used.
No, that was our primary experience with it. Your study.
Yeah, other researchers seem like I mentioned you just don't get the biomass we were looking for weed control. There does seem to be better results with the fall rye, but then the actual seeding can be trickier. I know people will like add weights to the seeder to like push it down harder to help it cut through. So some people will try and hack it with some added weights. But yeah, it's not a perfect system yet.
And Carolyn Hall did an interesting, I mean, some of the limitations in Eastern Canada are other than equipment, the cool soil conditions and the low adoption of this system have been for other reasons as well. Carolyn did a nice summary in Quebec where you've got those heavier clay soils and cool conditions that delayed adoptions and be an issue as well.
Okay, and I've had a couple of follow-up questions. So a disc or a hoe drill was one of the follow-ups. Does that make sense? Or have you
asked? I catch that.
It was a disc, I think. Like the soil itself wasn't turned at all. It was just the cutting disc was just there to cut the mulch apart.
Perfect. And then one further question. Any studies that look at the perimeters for the difference between tilling a green manure and using a chemical to terminate a cover crop?
Not that I've been involved in, but
Yeah.
I'm sure, I'm pretty sure there have been, and maybe perhaps Martin can comment. So sort of chem fallow or using burn down or I think there have been studies on that done as well.
Okay,
yeah,
for sure. Yeah, no, one of the things that I found really interesting, Carolyn, in your presentation is that bit about green manures being a buffer against the negative the negative impacts of tillage, and I think that's really I don't know, really important for organic farmers to hear, because I think there is so much there continues to be kind of this need, and I'm not 100% sure why, to create that sort of adversarial sort of relationship between the organic and non-organic farmers, and whenever there's a bit research and information that can again support the the organic production practices, I think that's really helpful. So I appreciated hearing it. That's the bit where I went, oh, that's such great information for organic farmers to have, because they do get a lot of negative comments around tillage. But having said that, I think it's really important with new equipment and those sorts of things to kind of weigh up the benefits of reducing tillage if possible, and just I guess that would make it the less tillage and more green manures, like the combination of those two things could really really be beneficial, and something that I always encourage when I'm talking with organic farmers, especially new organic farmers, is that getting your organic certification is just the beginning of a journey, right? And that we really always need to be looking at how to improve crop rotations, how to incorporate green manures and just increase biodiversity on organic farms overall. Because at least here on the prairies, obviously we do a lot of large acres, largely monocrops. Can have great rotations, but we still have to take that into account when we're when we're farming. So thank you to you both. I think we're going to move on here to Martin and our next presentation. But if just keep your questions coming, and maybe Carolyn and Derek, we might bring you back in at the end if there are some additional questions. So thank you again for being with us here today. And it is with great pleasure that I'm introducing Dr. Martin Entz. Martin has done a few webinars for us, and we're very appreciative every time he comes and joins us. Martin is a professor of cropping systems and natural systems agriculture at the University of Manitoba. And Martin leads the Glen Lee Long-Term Rotation Study, Canada's oldest organic versus conventional farming systems experiment, and which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. And just a little plug for Abundance magazine, which is coming out the first week in July. Martin has written us an article on that study and has summarized the research results and provided other information and reflections on that 30-year study. So I'll thank Martin for that as well. And over to you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to show my screen here, let the technology do its thing.
Perfect.
I'm kind of waiting for it.
And we can see your screen, but it's your email, it looks like.
Oh, okay. We don't want that. How's that? Is that better?
That's perfect.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
okay.
for sure.
So thanks, Derek. And I'm gonna get rid of myself here. Good. Thanks, Derek and Carolyn. It's fun to work with you again. And good morning, everyone, or whenever you're watching this webinar, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I want to address these 4 questions today. And I'm really happy that Derek and Carolyn talked about some of the processes that happen in soils when you add green manures, because it's really good fundamental knowledge. And we actually are very lucky in Canada to have so many scientists considering green manures. So the first question, I've got it in red here: should I plant a green manure in a drought year? And we certainly here in the Red River Valley, we've had almost no rain all summer. It's very, very dry. Now, we always tell people that, there's a green manure for almost every soil and water condition. And that is actually true. We can grow, Indian head lentil and things like chickling vetch, which you see on your screen, which I hope you see on your screen in this picture. It says chickling vetch, good for drought conditions. So hopefully Marla can see that, and the webinar is going all right.
Yes, we can see it. That's great.
Okay, thank you very much. And so, theoretically, we do have a green manure that can fit into almost every niche of growing, but even acid soils, we can grow lupins and In wet soils, we can grow faba beans, or in hot conditions, we can grow forage soybeans. You know, it's maybe not the problem of the choice of a green manure. It's like in a drought year, how do we get it established? And if we have very little moisture, what time of year do we seed it? And I think this is an important question. And farmers know on their own farms when they have soil moisture. So I'll get to that in a minute. But the other factor that influences is the type of species that you're growing, and especially the seed size. So if we look on the screen here, we've got a picture of field pea seeds. And, you know, compared to wheat down here, they're quite a bit larger, or they can be quite a bit larger. And that means they need more water to germinate. Over on the right here, we have this image, and it has the word imbibition, and that is the water moving into the seeds. So if we put dry seeds in a beaker and we add water, we come back, you know, several hours later or a day later, and we see the seeds have soaked up all that water. And so, you know, you can actually try this with different types of seeds like mustard and lentil and chickpea, and find out which of your seeds require the most water. And what we tend to know is that the larger seeds require more water. And so we often have to seed them deeper to get to that water. The good news is they can be seeded deeper, but that is a consideration. And I remember when I started working on green manures, I was not a very good agronomist, I don't think. We always seeded our peas too shallow. And, you know, just, you know, thinking about getting it out of the ground quickly. And some years we just didn't get a very good stand because they used up all the water in the surface, and that was it. I'm going to excuse myself because I'm going to close my window. Sorry, there's a dog barking in the background. Okay, so seed size is a factor. And then, you know, with that in mind, getting back to the question of what time of year to seed forages or to seed green manure crops, you know, the one time of year that might be the most reliable is when you've got snow melt water. And that's exactly what we did this spring on our farm. We've seeded an oat crop. That's an oat grain crop. It's an organic crop, and we underseeded it to sweet clover. This is not a usual practice for us. We tend to grow annual green manures because we like to have fall tillage to control the thistles. But we knew we were very dry. We had very little snow, almost no rain last year. And so we took a chance and established green manure at the time of seeding the main crop. And as you can see from the picture, it worked out. Now, the other part of the story, which I should share with you, is the soil was really dry when we seeded. And so this was typical organic management. What we did is we cultivated the soil with a Vibrishank cultivator the day that we seeded. So we had moisture there, we tried to conserve it, but we had to put the seeds, you know, a good 2.5 to 3 inches deep, which meant the sweet clover in our seeding system also went that deep. And it did establish. So that's one of the things I wanted to emphasize, is that when we think about what time of year to seed our green manures, using that snow melt water is one of the times where we do have water, but that means seeding it along with our grain crop, which of course many organic farmers have experience with. The other end of the growing season is after harvest, and there's a lot of interest in cover cropping. That's another time of year where it sometimes gets a little wetter. We can get, the humidity goes up. There can be some rains. The water is conserved, but because it's cooler. And this is just a picture of volunteer peas. This is somebody grew grain peas, tilled the soil after harvest, and And this just shows that the fall period, is a time when we can establish some cover crops. And so, you can sort of draw your own conclusions. But this is something that we should at least be aware of. And I know there were farmers that I've heard historically they would seed sweet clover with their fall rye in the fall, and that sweet clover would actually overwinter as a way of establishing a green manure. So I'm really emphasizing dry conditions because in wet soils, it's pretty easy to get establishment of green manure. Okay, now the third question I want to address is in some ways kind of the elephant in the room, and that's, well, why don't I just summer fallow? So how much water for next year's crop will the green manure rob compared to just summer fallowing, which is a practice that used to be quite widespread in the prairies and is still used to some extent on organic farms? Well, first of all, there are ways of summer fallowing that are not as destructive. So here we have summer fallow, which on the left, which looks pretty horrible. That soil is going to blow away. And here's a farmer in Montana using a wide blade cultivator, and that minimizes the burying of residue during summer fallow. And I think it'd be really interesting to look at the influence of the wide blade cultivator on things like earthworms and things like that Carolyn is interested in, because I don't think it's nearly as destructive. And just before I get into the water part, this is what happens on that at Villicus Farms, the Crabtree farm in Montana. They're in a very dry area. They also put these perennial strips every 70 meters. I don't know if they've done this on the whole 9,000 acres of their organic farm, so that if you are summer fallowing, we need to use responsible practices. So if there's soil drifting, hopefully it drifts into these things and it doesn't leave the field. And these perennial strips also allow things like perches for raptors and other biodiversity. But that wasn't really the question. The question I was asking is if we summer fallow, are we storing water more efficiently than if we grow green manure? Or to turn that around, in a dry year, if I grow green manure, am I going to use all my water and I'll have a lousy crop next year? Well, there's been a lot of research on the prairies on water conservation in fallow systems, and I want to share some of that data with you. Here's a study that was conducted at Swift Current at the Ag Canada station from 1967 to 2006. So a 40-year data set. And let me explain the data to you. So here, there was a crop harvested of wheat. And then from the time that the crop was harvested to freeze up that first autumn, 17 millimeters of water were conserved on average in the soil, in the top 120 centimeters or 4 feet. And then from freeze up till the next spring, 47 millimeters of water were stored. That's almost 2 inches. Okay, so that's that snow melt water. And then during the summer fallow year, and they used conservation techniques during summer fallow, minimum tillage, 31 millimeters, which is just over an inch. It's not a lot of water for all that summer fallow. And then that second winter, very little water is conserved. So most of the water that's conserved in summer fallow is during the first winter and a little bit during the summer fallow year. So before I talk about introducing a green manure here, let me just say that one of the reasons that we call it conservation efficiency during the second winter is so low is because, well, the soil water content is already perhaps quite high, but there's nothing to trap snow, or there's very little to trap snow. And maybe that's why the crab trees have those perennial strips. And that research on perennial strips and snow trapping has also been done in Canada back before the days of Roundup. Okay, so here's really the question is, when you add a green manure during that fallow year, so you don't actually have a fallow, we know that you're going to conserve less water here because the green manure is going to use water. But we also know that you're going to increase the water conservation in that second winter because you're going to have something that could trap snow. And this is exactly what Carolyn talked about. This is the barley hairy vetch green manure that we zero till in. This is the organic rotation at Glenlee. And so this trade-off is, I think, what people need to be thinking about in a dry year. And as every organic farmer in Saskatchewan knows, in the dryland, southern Saskatchewan knows, is the time that you terminate this green manure is really important. The earlier you terminate it, the less water you use. And that work has been done, published at Swift Current Ag Canada by Bix Peterbeck and the colleagues. And if anybody hasn't seen those papers, I can send them to you. Okay, so that really becomes a question. Well, the good news is, more recently, scientists at Swift Current took another look at the effect of green manures on this water conservation. They were asking the question, how much water does the green manure use instead of, compared to summer fallow? And then how well does that soil recharge over winter? So what they found is, I'll have to explain this diagram to you. The bottom thing here is the soil depth. So this is the top 15 centimeters, then this is the 3 to 4 foot depth down here, okay? And this shows the change in soil water between termination of the green manure and the following spring. And you can see the black line is summer fallow, so that means that the summer fallow didn't gain a lot of water. It was probably already filled up by spring rains during the summer fallow year. And this is average of 3 years. So I'm looking at the graph on the right-hand side because this is the average of these 3 years. And we can see that, for example, a field pea, the green is early seeded field pea, you can see it recharged a lot more water during during this period here than the summer fallow did, okay? Now, if we look at the individual years, we can see some years the summer fallow also recharged, but in all cases where the green manures were added, which is all the lines that aren't the black line, you can see there was an increase in water content over that second winter. And so this is what's making people think, well, maybe that green manure managed properly, even in a drought year, is worth it, because there is a way of gaining that water back. Now, the next graph here shows the actual amount of water. Oh, no, sorry, this is the nitrogen available in the following spring. And I actually put the wrong graph in here. I wanted to talk about the water, so I'm going to go back to this one here and show that by the following spring, the moisture in the surface soil was a little higher where there was summer fallow, but the moisture throughout the profile was no different. And so that then raises the question of how can we increase the use of green manures in dry years, but have moisture available in the surface soil for seeding. And that brings us back to Villicus Farms in Montana, where they use the wide blade cultivator, not just for managing summer fallow, which is its traditional use on organic farms, but actually for terminating the green manure. And they do one pass and then leave it for the remainder of the year. And I'm sure they may have to do second pass in some fields if they have perennial weeds. But we've also done a bit of research with this at the University of Manitoba, and the wide blade cultivator, adjusted properly with sharp blades, does a pretty good job in some pretty significant green manure growth. There's other tools that can be used to manage the green manure without tillage. This is, you can use a flail mower, you can use the roller crimper, which Carolyn talked about. You can use livestock, which do a great job, although they could remove all the residue. So there's other techniques that can be used. Okay, the final point I want to make is, in a year like this, if we wouldn't have established our sweet clover on our farm in the springtime, we would not get a good green manure growing. It has not rained since we got about 10 millimeters after we seeded those oats. That's all we've had. In other parts of Manitoba and Western Manitoba, they've had quite a bit more rain. I don't know what it's like where you are. So we've been looking at very, very dry conditions. If we seeded a PO, if we seeded anything right now, it'd be a waste of our seed. So how do you deal with that situation? So if we miss the green manure because of a drought, if it starts raining in August, we can go and seed something, and we will. But if we miss seeding a green manure crop, not all is lost. There's a couple of principles that are important to remember. First of all, back in the old days when I was a student in Saskatchewan, we used to talk about, our professors would say that, summer fallowing may actually be not that bad for soil conservation because it produces high yielding crops with a lot of residue. And that residue, if you manage it properly with minimum tillage, can actually last you through a summer fallow year. Whereas if you're growing a crop here that's very low yield, there's not as much residue there and you don't get as much water conservation. And there's data to show this. So, because that residue on the surface is really what reduces our evaporation of water. The other thing that we know, as Carolyn has showed, is that if we grow a perennial legume cover crop for a couple of years, we heal the mistakes that we've made by that summer fallow year. And there's very good data from many places around the world where the soil health kind of declines as you go through a tillage phase or summer fallow, and then you put a perennial in for, let's say, 4 years, and the soil health will improve. And so that's one thing that can be done. And so for dryland organic farmers who are in a drought situation where they're really having trouble getting their green manures going, that's just make sure the soil doesn't blow away, put on those perennial strips, use the minimum till systems, try to grow a green manure, but if not, put that land into a perennial for 2 to 5 years, every 12 years, and that will be every bit as good as growing a green manure one year out of 3. And the data, I think, would support that. And the other nice thing about perennials like alfalfa is they put the carbon deeper in the soil, they deal with salinity, which is a perennial problem in our production region in dry years. So that's my story today, this morning, this afternoon, or this evening. And I'm going to turn it back over to the moderator.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Martin, for your presentation. I think all 3 researchers have presented compelling reasons to incorporate green manures for sure. And also, obviously the pros and the cons of doing that. And like with all farming, it is so dependent on your individual farm's requirements, right? So trying to figure out that puzzle and getting as much information as you can is really useful and important. I do have some questions, so I will start with those. So I'm going to start from the bottom up because I think there were a couple for Carolyn and Derek as well that we didn't get to. So how do you seed clover with a cereal? Do you pre-mix them while putting them into the hopper? Anyone?
Well, I think I talked about the clover, and there's many different ways of seeding it. On our farm, we don't have the greatest equipment, so we seeded them in the same furrow. We just mix it in the seed box, and it works okay, but there's many more sophisticated ways of doing it. There's what's called a grass seed attachment on a grain drill, and which farmers don't really use anymore. They're using air seeders on the prairies. And in the case of air seeders, you can use the different boxes on the air seeder, one for clover, one for your grain crop, and put them each at their appropriate rate. And you can even put clover down one of the other openers. You're not using your fertilizer spout probably in an organic, so you can adjust the depth to optimize the clover depth with your fertilizer applicator. So there's many different ways of doing that effectively. I wanted to show the worst case scenario in my example because it really shows the potential of sweet clover to come up from great depths. So.
Okay, great, thank you. And another one, how was the cover underseeded? Again, type of seeder used, settings on the seeder to manage 2 seeds. Is that?
Answer on that image that I showed you, that was using an Edwards no-till disc drill. It's a hoe drill, and people will hear that and they'll go, oh, that's not a very prosperous farm, but that's what we have, so that's what we use.
Okay, great. I don't know if Derek or Carolyn wanted to, if you had a response to that question as well, or? Oh.
No, I'm fine to go on to another question.
Okay, for sure.
No, I would add that seeding clovers, a lot of farmers would broadcast it and harrow it in, or just, but that doesn't work in a dry year. And so really I was emphasizing drought conditions, but certainly farmers in the black soil zone of the prairies or in Eastern Canada, they would be having a lot of success with broadcasting and harrowing in many years. But that's not an assured way of establishing clover in a dry year.
Okay, and then another question, does rolling the crop effectively kill the crop from moisture preservation? Question mark. This one came in after Derek and Carolyn's presentation.
Yeah, we didn't do a lot of moisture, like our problem is usually too much moisture, which is probably different. In terms of killing the crop, so when we were doing vetch, it didn't kill the vetch, but it kills the companion crop. So we had oats or barley, and the physical crimping would kill that, the oats or the barley. But the vetch would continue to grow, and then it would winter kill. So it would sort of puff back up and grow, but then it would die over the winter. And I'm not sure what it did. We found more moisture under our green manure, but I think that's partly climatic. Our springs are wet, and then the mulch keeps it wet.
Perfect, thank you.
In the prairie region, we've also worked with that system. Well, Carolyn did one of her experiments at Manitoba. We've looked at soil water of that rolling system. It's excellent at conserving water. And if people go to our Natural Systems Agriculture website, there's a video of us no-till drilling into it, showing just really fantastic moisture. So it's an excellent system. The problem we have with that system is when we use a no-till disc drill and we cut the mulch, if you get a strong wind, the mulch will actually start rolling. And so it breaks my heart to have to say that, because it's something that I would love to see used more. And but that's one challenge that we found with that system. But it's excellent at conserving moisture for planting, and I would still recommend it for that purpose.
Perfect, thank you. Another question, what are the factors contributing to organic having higher soil health than conventional? Is it the diversity?
I think that's a lot to do to it. So I mentioned that one meta-analysis that wasn't looking specifically at organic, but there are lots of broad studies like that, and they compare conventional systems versus organic. And it's very broad, so they're not necessarily comparing specific practices like tillage, or it's more of an overall picture. And I do think it's just the tendency, where you can't rely on chemical inputs in organic. You're looking for more natural solutions to problems, and those are often cover crops or green manure. And not only are you addressing, whatever need you've brought that in for, but you're building your soil health and you're creating more diversity. So I think it's just a more complex system overall, which is beneficial.
Perfect.
My connection is cutting in and out.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could repeat that question, Marla.
I could just let me pop this out. So the question is, I'm hoping that I can find it again here. What are the factors contributing to organic having higher soil health than conventional farming? Is it the diversity or the biodiversity? Oh, and you're cutting out a little bit. Maybe if you turn your camera off, that sometimes helps with the audio. And maybe, well, oh, there we go. Do you want to try again, Derek?
Yeah, I don't want to hold you up.
No.
It was a question about biodiversity.
Yes, yeah. And so what are the factors contributing to organic having a higher soil health than conventional?
I think everything we were talking about, the combination of in the work we're doing in the large in Quebec, there's a whole of combination of degrees of best management practice in a sense. Looking at, I mean, using different ranges of tillage intensity, they're using different range of amendments, and they're using different strategies of winter wheat or not, or different type and timing of cover cropping. And that's what we're going to try and tease apart with that study, is look at, that spectrum of management, all of which, as Carolyn very nicely summarized, are sort of the key pillars of contributing to soil health. So it's that's what I find fantastic in organic. There's really such a spectrum of management.
Right. Thanks, Derek.
I would add to that. I would agree with everything that Carolyn and Derek have said, but I would say for, the crop rotation is very important. And I don't know if we have good data for Canada, but if we look at Europe, the average organic farm grows 5 to 7 crops. And in conventional, it's probably more like 2 to 3 crops. And I think that is really critical to a biodiverse soil system in organic as well. If people are growing just wheat and fallow, they will not have more diversity.
For sure. Yeah, no, thanks for that.
I would agree. And those sort of shorter rotation farms, but that's the purpose of, that's why we're on the.
All right. Sorry, Derek, just so you know, you're just cutting in and out a little bit. So I have a question, and this might be a webinar all on its own, but what is the difference between cover cropping and green manures? Just
so
my
I
naive
would
question.
consider green manure to be one type of cover crop. So you can grow a cover crop for multiple reasons. I mean, by the name, it's there to cover the soil, but they usually have another purpose. So you can grow a root, like a large rooting cover crop to break up compaction. There are certain cover crops that will mine nutrients like phosphorus from the lower soil levels to break up a disease cycle. And then a green manure is a cover crop that you grow to add organic material and nutrients to the soil, like an animal manure. That's how I look at it.
For sure. No, thank you. Because I guess one of the reasons I asked the question is kind of related to Martin's question, or Martin talking us through, in a drought year, what do you do, right? Because there's so much information out right now, and for the last, I would say 3 or 4 years, just around cover cropping and the importance of that, and these cocktails of mixes, right, that folks are trying out on their farms. And I guess my thought went to, does the number of species matter when we're talking about, you know, germination and water availability or moisture availability? And, you know, so just kind of thinking, you know, I don't know if it's a good question or not, but that's where my brain went when I was thinking about the difference between those two, because I think having a bit of clarity around that as well, just so that, you know, we understand like the difference, the different uses and the benefits. So I'll stop talking.
Do you want to answer? Do you want to take a stab, Carolyn? I do have some thoughts as well, but maybe you want to go first.
No, you go ahead. I did the last talking.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Well, that's a great question. I mean, ecologically, we know that the more diversity, the more robust the system is, especially in perennial systems. You know, there's a study. There's studies around the world that have shown that, but in terms of what's practical on the farm, there are also some, you know, sort of cover crop green manure studies that show that putting different functional groups in the mixture is important. So a functional group is, you know, a legume functions to add nitrogen, a brassica functions to, you know, put in a taproot, cereal functions to have a fibrous root system, and crop like a sunflower functions to have a very deep root system. So putting those functional groups together may be a good idea. There is a cost factor, though, that is real. And so, you know, I think that's a trade-off that people have to make. And, you know, probably we're at the stage where it's certainly on the dryland prairies where growing a cover crop and one that includes some legume is the priority for now. And as farmers get more comfortable with that, they can maybe start exploring more diverse mixes, more expensive mixes. And when there is moisture, they are very productive.
Mm. And just sort of one follow-on question that just popped into my mind was, you know, we have this idea, or we talk about competition a lot, right? How plants are competing with each other. And, you know, again, my wonder is that how nature works? Do plants compete, or do they coexist and work? You know, I guess that idea of companion planting, right? That sometimes I never get it right. The sum is greater than its parts.
They in nature, plants do compete. They also facilitate. And you know, the word facilitation is really important in crop mixtures. So if you have a crop of sorghum with a legume, you know, the legume is going to give some nitrogen to the sorghum. The sorghum is perhaps going to share some nutrients with the legume through the mycorrhizal network, if the soil is healthy enough to have mycorrhiza. So that's called facilitation. But there's always competition. We just did a study on pea oat intercropping and found that adding oats to the pea crop made it less economically attractive because it reduced the pea yield. So both competition and facilitation are always happening at the same time. And so that's the reality of a mixture.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you for that. Any other thoughts, comments, parting thoughts? One reason why all farmers should try out organic farmers or all farmers should try out a green manure if they haven't already.
Marla, we did have one more question.
Oh, perfect. Do you want to?
I can read it out, sure.
Yeah, if you can read it out, that'd be great.
So this person planted fall rye plus sweet clover and alfalfa. They seeded about 3/4 of an inch. The rye did well. Clover and alfalfa did not establish. Why? Imbibe and dry out, freeze the allelopathy of the rye. They seeded in late April.
Well, I'll give a perspective on that since I talked about that. You know, I suspect it's not so much allelopathy because rye is, you know, and clovers are you do grow them. I would say it's probably mostly moisture. And I'd like to ask that person how much precipitation there was and how much rainfall there was. It could be competition as well. Yeah. I'm a little surprised. I'm a little surprised that there wasn't at least some clover. So I wonder if it was moisture.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for that answer. And I think that I'm just going to check one last time, but I think that that's our last question. So with that, I would like to thank you all again for taking the time to prepare your presentations and be here today and share the information that you have with organic farmers and others who are on the webinar today. So thank you all again, and we will share. I know there were a few papers mentioned and also links to websites. If there's anything else, Derek, Carolyn, or Martin, that you think might be of interest to folks who've been on the webinar, if you could send those to Deb, that would be great, and we'll share them on. And so, yeah, with that, I say thank you, and on I go to my final slides. So thank you to our speakers again. Thank you all for attending today, and just a reminder that you'll receive a link to the webinar within a day. And right after you close out of this webinar, you're going to receive a short, or asked to fill out a short survey. We'd really be grateful if you would. It helps us plan future webinars. And thank you again to our sponsors, gold sponsors, Grain Millers, ProCert, and FW Cobbs, bronze sponsors, OCIA International, Wheat Surfer, and BioFert. And upcoming events, so we've started having monthly virtual on-farm research and organic agronomy calls. They're with Dunling Wang, our alternative cropping specialist with the Ministry of Agriculture. So the next one will be that first Wednesday of July at 8:30. And if you missed some of our past webinars, they are available for sale on our website, as well as Advancing Organics online. So there's lots of information out there for you to access. And that's it for us today. Thank you again for being with us, and we'll see you soon.